9.5 Physiology of skeletal muscle. Muscle twitch, a single brief contraction and relaxation cycle in a muscle fiber, is called a muscle twitch. A twitch does not last long enough to generate enough tension to perform any work. Even though the normal function of muscle is more complex, a muscle twitch can serve as an example of how muscle functions in living organisms. Figure 9.17 shows a hypothetical contraction of a single muscle fiber in response to a single action potential. The time between the application of the stimulus in the motor neuron and the beginning of the contraction is the lag phase, latent phase. The time during which contraction occurs is the contraction phase, and the time during which relaxation occurs is the relaxation phase. An action potential is an electrical event, but contraction is a mechanical event. An action potential is measured in millivolts and compared in less than 2 milliseconds. Muscle contraction is measured as a force, also called tension. It is reported as the number of grams lifted or the distance the muscle shortens and requires up to 1 second to occur. Motor units. A motor unit is a single motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. Figure 9.18. An action potential in the motor neuron generates an action potential in each of the muscle fibers of the motor unit. However, not all motor units are identical. Motor units vary in terms of the number of muscle fibers they contain, and they vary in terms of the sensitivity to the stimuli for the contraction. Some motor units respond readily to weak stimuli, whereas others respond only to a strong stimuli. That is why human skeletal muscles are capable of fluid movements. Motor unit number. Motor units in different muscles do not always contain the same number of muscle fibers. Muscles performing delicate and precise movements have motor units with a small number of muscle fibers, whereas muscle performing more powerful but less precise contractions have motor units with many muscle fibers. For example, the delicate muscles such as those that move the eye, the number of muscle fibers per motor unit can be less than 10, whereas in the heavy muscles of the thigh, the number can be several hundred. Therefore, the fewer fibers there are in the motor unit of the muscle, the greater control a person has over the muscle. Prediction 4. The disease, poliomyelitis, destroys motor neurons, causing loss of muscle function and even flaccid paralysis. Some patients recover because axon branches form from the remaining motor neurons. These branches innervate the paralyzed muscle fibers to produce motor units with many more muscle fibers than usual. How does this reinnervation of muscle fibers affect the degree of muscle control in a person who has recovered from poliomyelitis? Stimulus strength and motor unit response. The strength of muscle contraction varies from weak to strong. In other words, whole muscle responds to stimuli in a graded fashion. For example, the force muscles generate to lift a feather is much less than the force required to lift a 25-pound weight. The force of contraction is increased in two ways. 1. Summation involves increasing the force of the contraction of the muscle fibers within the muscle, and recruitment involves increasing the number of muscle fibers contracting. When a muscle fiber demonstrates summation, it is usually because a condition within the muscle fibers have changed. A muscle fiber, when stimulated in rapid succession, contracts with greater force with each subsequent stimulus, a phenomenon called trippe. Trippe occurs in a muscle fiber that has rested for a prolonged period. If the muscle fiber is maximally stimulated at a low frequency, which allows complete relaxation between the stimuli, the successive contractions are stronger and stronger. A possible explanation for trippe is an increase in Ca2+ levels around the myofibrils. The Ca2+ release in response to the first stimulus is not taken up completely by the sarcoplasmic reticulum before a second stimulus causes the release of additional Ca2+, even though the muscle relaxes completely between the muscle twitches. As a consequence, during the first few contractions of the muscle, the Ca2+ concentration in the sarcoplasm increases slightly, making the contraction more efficient because of the increased number of ions available to bind the troponin. Stimulus frequency and whole muscle contraction. An action potential in a single muscle fiber causes it to contract, but the action potential is completed long before the contraction phase is completed. In addition, the contractile mechanism in a muscle fiber exhibits no unresponsive period. That is, relaxation of a muscle fiber is not required before a second action potential can stimulate a second contraction. As the frequency of action potentials in a skeletal muscle fiber increases, the frequency of contraction also increases until a period of sustained contraction or tetanus is achieved. In incomplete tetanus, muscle fibers partially relax between the contractions. In complete tetanus, muscle fibers produce an action potential so rapidly that no relaxation occurs between them. As the frequency of contractions increase, the increased tension produced is called multiple wave summation. Tetanus of a muscle caused by stimuli of increasing frequency can be explained at a chemical level, as with trepe. A muscle fiber that has been stimulated at a high frequency accumulates more Ca2 plus in the sarcoplasm, and thus the number of crossribs formed increases. Therefore, in comparing trepe and tetanus, we see that the mechanism is very similar: increased sarcoplasmic Ca2 plus, but the delivery of stimulus to the muscle is different. For trepe, stimulus is maximal but delivered at a low frequency, whereas tetanus, the stimulus is at threshold but delivered at a high frequency. A significant factor in multiple wave summation is the fact that the sarcoplasm and the connective tissue components of muscle have some elasticity. During each separate muscle twitch, some of the tension produced by the contracting muscle fibers is used to stretch those elastic elements, and the remaining tension is applied to the load to be lifted. In a single muscle twitch, relaxation begins before the elastic components are totally stretched. The maximum tension produced during a single muscle twitch is therefore not applied to the load to be lifted. However, in a muscle stimulated at a high frequency, the elastic elements stretch during the very early part of the prolonged contraction. After that, all the tension produced by the muscle is applied to the load to be lifted, and the observed tension produced by the muscle increases. Muscle length to tension ratios. Active tension is the force applied to an object to be lifted when a muscle contracts. The initial length of a muscle has a strong influence on the amount of active tension it produces. As the length of the muscle increases, the active tension also increases to a point. If the muscle stretches farther than its optimum length, the active tension it produces begins to decline. The muscle length plotted against the tension produced by the muscle in response to maximal stimuli is the active tension curve. If a muscle stretches so that the actin and myosin myofilaments within the sarcomeres do not overlap, or overlap to a very small extent, the muscle produces very little active tension when it is stimulated. Also, if the muscle does not stretch at all, the myosin filaments touch each of the Z discs in the end sarcomere, and very little contraction of the sarcomeres can occur. If the muscle stretches to its optimum length, optimal overlap of the actin and myosin myofilaments takes place. When the muscle is stimulated, crossbridge formation results in maximal contraction. Before lifting heavy objects, weightlifters and others usually assume positions in which their muscles are stretched close to their optimum length. For example, the position of a weightlifter assumes before powerlifting stretches the upper limb and lower limb muscles to a near optimum length for the muscle contraction. And the stance of a lineman assumes in a football game stretches most muscle groups in the lower limb so that they are near their optimum length for sudden movement of the body forward. Passive tension is the tension applied to the load when a muscle stretches but is not stimulated. It is similar to the tension produced if the muscle were replaced with an elastic band. Passive tension exists because the muscle and its connective tissue have some elasticity, and the sum of active and passive tension is called total tension. Muscle contractions. Muscle contractions are classified based on the type of contraction that predominates. An isometric contraction, the length of the muscle does not change, but the amount of tension increases during contraction. Isometric contractions are responsible for the constant length of the posture muscles of the body, such as the muscles that hold the spine erect while a person is sitting or standing. In isotonic contractions, the amount of tension produced by the muscle is constant during contraction, but the length of the muscle changes. Movements of the upper limb or fingers as in waving or using a computer keyboard, are predominantly isotonic contractions. Although some mechanical differences exist, both type of contraction results from the same contractile process within muscle fibers. Also, most muscle contractions are not strictly isometric or isotonic. For example, both the length and the tension of muscle changes when the person walks or opens a heavy door. Concentric contractions are isotonic contractions in which the tension of the muscle is great enough to overcome the opposing resistance and the muscle shortens. Concentric contractions result in an increase in tension of the muscle shortens. Many of the movements performed by muscle requires concentric contractions. For example, lifting a loaded backpack from the floor to a tabletop. Eccentric contractions are isotonic contractions in which tension is maintained in a muscle, but the opposing resistance is great enough to cause the muscle to increase in length. For example, eccentric contractions occur when a person slowly lowers a heavy weight. Eccentric contractions produce substantial force. In fact, eccentric contractions during exercise often produce greater tension than concentric contractions do. Eccentric contractions are of clinical interest because repetitive eccentric contractions occur in the lower limbs of people who run downhill for long distances tend to injure muscle fibers and muscle connective tissue. Muscle tone is the constant tension produced by muscles for long periods of time. Muscle tone is responsible for keeping the back and lower limbs straight, the head upright, and the abdomen flat. Muscle tone depends on a small percentage of the motor units contracting out of phase with one another at any point in time. The frequency of nerve impulses causes incomplete tetanus for a short period, but the contracting motor units are stimulated in such a way that the tension produced by the whole muscle remains constant. Mary Myosin overheard an argument between two students who could not decide if a weightlifter who lifts a weight above the head and then holds it before lowering it is using isometric, concentric, or eccentric muscle fibers. Mary is an expert in muscle contraction, so she settles the debate. What is her explanation? Movement of the bodies are usually smooth and occur in widely different rates, some very slowly and others very rapidly. Very few body movements resemble the rapid contractions of individual muscle twitches. Rather smooth, slow contractions result from an increasing number of motor units contracting out of phase as the muscle shortens, as well as from a decreasing number of motor units contracting out of the phase as muscle lengthens. Each motor unit exhibits either incomplete or complete tetanus, but because the contractions are out of phase and because the number of motor units activated varies at each point in time, a smooth contraction results. Consequently, muscles are capable of contracting either slowly or rapidly, depending on the number of motor units stimulated and the rate at which the number increases or decreases. A summary of the physiological muscle responses is presented on Table 9.2. Muscle fatigue. Fatigue is the decreased capacity to do work and the reduced efficiency of performance that normally follows a period of activity. The rate at which individuals develop fatigue is highly variable, but it is a phenomenon that everyone has experienced. Fatigue can develop at three possible sites: the nervous system, the muscles, and the neuromuscular junction. Psychological fatigue, the most common type, involves the central nervous system. The muscles are capable of functioning, but the individual perceives that additional muscular work is not possible. A burst of activity in a tired athlete in response to encouragement from spectators shows that psychological fatigue can be overcome. The onset and duration of psychological fatigue vary greatly and depend on the emotional state of the individual. The second most common type of fatigue occurs in the muscle fiber. Muscular fatigue results from calcium ion imbalances as ATP levels drop. Without adequate ATP levels in muscle fibers, cross bridges and ion transport cannot function normally. As a consequence, the tension that a muscle is capable of producing declines. Fatigue in the lower limbs of marathon runners and in the upper and lower limbs of swimmers are examples. The least common type of fatigue is called synaptic fatigue, occurs in the neuromuscular junction. If the action potential frequency in motor neurons is great enough, the amount of acetylcholine released from the presynaptic terminals is greater than the amount synthesized. As a result, the synaptic vesicles become depleted and insufficient. Acetylcholine is released to stimulate the muscle fibers. Under normal psychological conditions, synaptic fatigue is rare, but it can occur under conditions of extreme exertion. As a result of extreme muscular fatigue, muscles occasionally become incapable of either contracting or relaxing, a condition called psychological contracture, which is caused by a lack of ATP within the muscle fibers. ATP can decline to very low levels when a muscle is stimulated strongly, as occurred during extreme exercise. When ATP levels are very low, active transport of Ca2+ into the sarcoplasmic reticulum slows. Ca2+ accumulate within the sarcoplasm, and ATP is unavailable to bind to the myosin molecules that have formed cross bridges with the actin myofilaments. As a consequence, the previously formed cross bridges cannot release, resulting in physiological contracture. Rigor mortis. The development of rigor muscles several hours after death is similar to physiological contracture. Shortly after death, ATP production stops and ATP levels within the muscle fibers decline. Because of low ATP levels, active transport of Ca2+ into the sarcoplasmic reticulum stops, and Ca2+ leaks from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm. Calcium ions can also leak from the sarcoplasmic reticulum as its membrane breaks down after cell death. As Ca2+ levels increase in the sarcoplasm, cross bridges form. However, too little ATP is available to bind the myosin molecules, so the cross bridges are unable to release and reform in a cyclic fashion to produce contractions. As a consequence, the muscles remain stiff until tissue begins to degenerate. Energy sources. ATP is the immediate source of energy for muscle contraction. As long as adequate amounts of ATP are present, muscles can contract repeatedly for a long time. ATP must be synthesized continuously to sustain muscle contractions, and ATP synthesis must be equal to the ATP breakdown because the small amount of ATP stored in muscle fibers is sufficient to support vigorous muscle contractions for only a few seconds. The energy required to produce ATP comes from the three sources: creatine phosphate, anaerobic respiration, and aerobic respiration. Table 9.3. Only the main points of anaerobic respiration and aerobic respiration are considered here. A more detailed discussion can be found in chapter 25. Creatine phosphate. During resting conditions, energy from aerobic respiration is used to synthesize creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate accumulates in muscle fibers where it stores energy that can be used to synthesize ATP. As ATP levels begin to fall, ATDP reacts with creatine phosphate to produce ATP and creatine. ADP plus creatine phosphate creates creatine kinase through the enzyme creatine kinase, gives you creatine plus ATP. The reaction catalyzed by the enzyme creatine kinase occurs very rapidly and is able to maintain ATP levels as long as creatine phosphate is available in the fiber. However, during intense muscular contraction, creatine phosphate levels are quickly exhausted. ATP and creatine phosphate present in the cell provide enough energy to sustain maximum contractions for about 8 to 10 seconds. Anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen and results in a breakdown of glucose to yield ATP and lactic acid. For each molecule of glucose metabolized, 2 ATP molecules and 2 molecules of lactic acid are produced. The first stages of anaerobic respiration and aerobic respiration share an enzymatic pathway called glycolysis. In glycolysis, a glucose molecule is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. 2 molecules of ATP are used in this process, but 4 molecules of ATP are produced, resulting in a net gain of 2 ATP molecules for each glucose molecule metabolized. In anaerobic respiration, the pyruvic acid is then converted into lactic acid. Unlike pyruvic acid, much of the lactic acid diffuses out of the muscle fibers into the bloodstream. Anaerobic respiration is less efficient than aerobic respiration, but it is much faster, especially when insufficient oxygen is available for aerobic respiration. By using many glucose molecules, anaerobic respiration can rapidly produce ATP for a short time. During short periods of intense exercise, such as sprinting, anaerobic respiration combined with the breakdown of creatine phosphate provides enough ATP to support intense muscular contractions for up to 3 minutes. However, ATP formation from creatine phosphate in anaerobic respiration is limited by the depletion of creatine phosphate in glucose and by the brief time anaerobic respiration can produce ATP. Aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen and breaks down glucose to produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. Aerobic respiration is much more efficient than anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration results in a net gain of 2 ATP molecules for each glucose molecule, whereas aerobic respiration can produce up to 36 ATP molecules for each glucose molecule. In addition, aerobic respiration uses a greater variety of molecules as energy sources, such as fatty acids and amino acids. Some glucose serves as an energy source in skeletal muscle, but fatty acids provide a more important source of energy during both sustained exercise and resting conditions. If aerobic respiration, pyruvic acid is metabolized by chemical reactions within the mitochondria. Two closely coupled sequences of reactions in mitochondria, called the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, produce many ATP molecules. Carbon dioxide molecules are produced, and in the last step, oxygen atoms combine with hydrogen atoms to form water. Thus, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP are major end products of aerobic respiration. The following equation represents the aerobic respiration of one molecule of glucose. Glucose plus 6 O2 plus 36 ADP plus 36 P6 gives you 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus about 36 ATP. Although aerobic respiration produces many more ATP molecules than anaerobic respiration does, the rate at which ATP molecules are produced is slower. Resting muscles, or muscles involved in long-term exercise such as long-distance running or other endurance activities, depend primarily on aerobic respiration for ATP synthesis. Oxygen deficit and recovery oxygen consumption. There is a lag time between when a person begins to exercise and when he or she begins to breathe more heavily because of the exercise. After exercise stops, there is another lag time before breathing returns to its pre-exercise rate. These changes in breathing patterns reflect muscles' need for more oxygen to produce ATP through aerobic respiration. The insufficient oxygen consumption relative to increased activity at the onset of exercise creates an oxygen deficit or oxygen debt. This deficit must be repaid during and after exercise, since oxygen consumption catches up with the increased activity level. At the onset of exercise, muscles primarily acquire ATP they need from the creatine phosphate system and anaerobic respiration, two systems that can supply ATP relatively quickly and without requiring oxygen. Table 9.3. The ability of aerobic respiration to supply ATP at the onset of exercise lags behind that of creatine phosphate systems and anaerobic respiration. This explains the lag between the onset of exercise and the need for increased oxygen. The elevated oxygen consumption that occurs after exercise has ended is called oxygen recovery consumption. A portion of recovery oxygen is used to repay the oxygen deficit incurred at the onset of exercise, but most of the recovery oxygen is used to support metabolic processes that restore homeostasis after it has been disturbed during exercise. Such disturbances include exercise-related increase in body temperature, changes in intra- and extracellular ion concentrations, and changes in metabolite and hormone levels. Recovery oxygen consumption generally lasts minutes to hours, depending on the individual's physical conditioning and on the length of the intensity of the exercise session. In extreme cases, such as following a marathon, recovery oxygen consumption can last as long as 15 hours. Slow twitch and fast twitch fibers. There are two major types of skeletal muscle fibers: slow twitch, and fast twitch. Not all skeletal muscles have identical functioning capabilities. They differ in several respects, including the composition of their muscle fibers, which may contain slightly different forms of myosin. The myosin of slow twitch muscle fibers causes the fibers to contract more slowly and to be more resistant to fatigue, whereas the myosin of fast twitch muscle fibers causes the fibers to contract quickly and to fatigue quickly. Table 9.4. The proportion of muscle fiber types differs within individual muscles. Slow twitch oxidative muscle fibers. Slow twitch oxidative muscle fibers, SO, type 1 fibers, contract more slowly and have better developed blood supply, have more mitochondria, and are more fatigue resistant than fast twitch muscle fibers. In women, type 1 alone or in conjunction with type 2A are the largest diameter fibers. Slow twitch muscle fibers respond relatively slowly to nervous stimulation. The enzyme on the myosin heads responsible for the breakdown of ATP are called myosin ATPase. Slow twitch fibers break down ATP slowly because their myosin heads have a slow form of myosin ATPase. The relatively slow breakdown of ATP means that cross-bridge movement occurs slowly, which causes the muscle to contract slowly. Aerobic respiration is primarily a source for ATP synthesis in slow twitch muscle fibers, and their capacity to perform aerobic respiration is enhanced by plentiful blood supply and the presence of numerous mitochondria. They are called oxidative muscle fibers because of their enhanced capacity to carry out aerobic respiration. Slow twitch fibers also contain large amounts of myoglobin, a dark pigment similar to hemoglobin in red blood cells, which binds oxygen and acts as an oxygen reservoir in the muscle fibers, and when the blood does not supply an adequate amount. Myoglobin thus enhances the capacity of the muscle fibers to perform aerobic respiration. Fast twitch muscle fibers. Fast twitch muscle fibers, type 2 fibers, respond rapidly to nervous stimulation, and their myosin heads have a fast form of myosin ATPase, which allows them to break down ATP more rapidly than slow twitch muscle fibers. This allows their cross bridges to release and form more rapidly than those in slow twitch muscle fibers. Muscles containing a high percentage of fast twitch fibers have a less well-developed blood supply than muscles containing a high percentage of slow twitch fibers. In addition, fast twitch muscle fibers have very little myoglobin and fewer and smaller mitochondria. Fast twitch muscle fibers have large deposits of glycogen and are well adapted to perform anaerobic respiration. However, the anaerobic respiration of fast twitch muscle fibers is not adapted for supplying a large amount of ATP for a prolonged period. The muscle fibers tend to contract rapidly for a shorter time and to fatigue relatively quickly. Fast twitch muscle fibers come in two forms, type 2A, or fast twitch oxidative glycolytic FOG fibers, and type 2B, or fast twitch glycolytic FG fibers, table 9.4. The type 2A fibers rely on both anaerobic and aerobic ATP production, whereas type 2B fibers rely almost exclusively on anaerobic glycolysis for ATP production. In men, type 2A are the largest diameter fibers. Distribution of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. The muscles of many animals are composed primarily of either fast or slow twitch muscle fibers. A chicken or pheasant breast, which is composed mainly of fast twitch fibers, appears whitish because it is relatively poor blood supply and lack of myoglobin. The muscles are adapted to contract rapidly for a short time, but they fatigue quickly. By contrast, the meat of a chicken leg or a dark breast is composed of slow twitch fibers and appear reddish or darker because of their relatively well-developed blood supply and larger amounts of myoglobin. These muscles are adapted to contract slowly for a longer time and to fatigue slowly. The distribution of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers is consistent with the behavior of these animals. For example, pheasants fly relatively fast for short distances, whereas ducks fly more slowly for long distances. Human muscles exhibit no clear separation of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers. Most muscles have both types of fibers, although the number of each varies for each muscle. The large postural muscles contain more slow twitch fibers, whereas the muscles of the upper limbs contain more fast twitch fibers. The distribution of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers in a given muscle is fairly constant for each individual and appears to be established during early development. Sprinters have a greater percentage of fast twitch fibers, whereas long-distance runners have a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers in their lower limb muscles. Athletes who perform a variety of anaerobic and aerobic exercises tend to have more balanced mixture of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. Effects of exercise. Neither fast twitch nor slow twitch muscle fibers can be easily converted to muscle fibers of the other type without specialized training. Training can increase the size and capacity of both types of muscle fibers so that they perform more efficiently. Intense exercise that requires anaerobic respiration, such as weightlifting, increases muscular strength and mass and causes fast twitch muscle fibers to enlarge more than slow twitch muscle fibers. Conversely, aerobic exercise increases the vascularity of muscles and causes slow twitch muscle fibers to enlarge more. Aerobic exercise training can convert some fast twitch muscle fibers that fatigue readily, type 2B, to fast twitch muscle fibers that resist fatigue, type 2A. In addition to changes in myosin, increases occur in both the number of mitochondria and in muscle fibers and in their blood supply. Weight training following by periods of rest can convert some muscle fibers from type 2A to type 2B. However, a type 1 muscle fiber cannot be converted to a type 2 fiber, and vice versa. Through specific training, a person with more fast twitch muscle fibers can run long distances, and a person with more slow twitch muscle fibers can increase the speed at which he or she runs. In response to exercise, a muscle increases in size or hypertrophies, and increases in strength and endurance. Conversely, a muscle that does not use decreases in size or atrophies. For example, muscular atrophy occurs in an arm or leg that is placed in a cast for several weeks. Because muscle fibers numbers do not change appreciably during most of a person's life, atrophy and hypertrophy result from changes in the size of an individual's muscle fibers. As a fiber increases in size, the number of myofibrils and sarcomeres increases. The number of nuclei in each muscle fiber increases in response to exercise, but the nuclei of muscle fibers cannot divide. New nuclei are added to muscle fibers because small satellite cells near skeletal muscle fibers increase in number in response to exercise and then fuse with the skeletal muscle fibers. Other elements such as blood vessels, connective tissue, and mitochondria also increase in number. Atrophy due to lack of exercise results from a decrease in all these elements without a decrease in muscle fiber number. However, severe atrophy, as occurs in elderly people who cannot readily move their limbs, does involve an irreversible decrease in numbers of muscle fibers and can lead to paralysis. The increased strength of trained muscle is greater than would be expected if the strength were based only on the change of muscle size. In a trained person, part of the increase in strength results from the nervous system's ability to recruit a large number of motor units simultaneously to perform movements with better neuromuscular coordination. In addition, trained muscles are usually less restrictive by exercise adipose tissue. Metabolic enzymes increase in hypertrophied muscle fibers, resulting in a greater capacity to take in nutrients and produce ATP. Improved endurance in trained muscles as a result is in part due to improved metabolism, increased circulation due to the exercise of muscle, increased numbers of capillaries and more efficient respiration, and a greater capacity of the heart to pump blood. The rate of metabolism in skeletal muscle differs before, during, and after exercise. As chemical reactions occur within cells, some energy is released in the form of heat. Normal body temperature results primarily from this heat. Because the rate of the chemical reactions increases in muscle fibers during contraction, the rate of heat production also increases, causing the rise in body temperature. After exercise, increased metabolism resulting from recovery oxygen consumption helps keep the body temperature elevated. But sweating and vasodilation of blood vessels in the skin speed heat loss and body temperature within the normal range. See chapter 25. When body temperature declines below a certain level, the nervous system responds by inducing shivering, rapid skeletal muscle contractions that produce shaking rather than coordinated movements. During shivering, the muscle movement increases heat production up to 18 times that of resting levels, and the heat produced can exceed the amount produced during moderate exercise. Thus, shivering helps raise body temperature to its normal range.